Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, the big news is that we've got a $68 billion deficit.
I mean, can you believe it? I guess we got a little preview of it in the past few weeks when legislative analyst was kind of teasing, revenue was declining. And remember, we had tax collection very late this year because of was it the fires and the floods that California got additional time? It was originally going to be October 16th, and then it ended up, I believe it was November 16th
Yeah, that's right.
Was the deadline. And so that throws everything off as far as revenue estimates to begin with, right? Because we have normally most of the tax payments come in March, April. And so we were kind of getting these little warnings of that things are not going very well. Well, it turned out Friday, the LAO put out their long-awaited initial outlook of where do they see revenue being in the year ahead. And it's pretty abysmal. And we're $68 billion in the hole. And what it means is the legislature and the governor are going to need to start right away to start making solutions to the budget, because one of the things is the sooner you make decisions in a budget year, the more positive impact you have in closing the deficit. Now, as an aside, you would think that it's just because of situations like this where we really should reform our tax system and our spending priorities so that we don't have to deal with this volatility nearly as much anymore. And thanks to the leadership of Republicans in the legislature a decade ago, we do have a rainy day fund with about $25 billion in it. But of course, when you have a $68 billion deficit, that's not going to fill all of the hole. So the issue now is, well, what is the legislature going to do? You may see some of the initial spending that was approved in last year's budget punted, because often legislators like to use kind of gimmicks and fun shifts and kicking the can down the road to deal with these. So they're already talking about that for the $25 minimum wage for healthcare workers that was just enacted, a lot of which will be paid for by the general fund. So we're going to see. And then, of course, there'll be a lot of praying that the economy won't continue to decline. If you think about it, we're having this issue with the economy kind of in a middling state. Boy, if we had a real downturn, we could face a real severe budget problem really quick. So we're going to see now the next shift is going to be when the governor unveils his budget January 10th, and then the legislature will respond with their budget priorities. But I think you're going to see all of the above cuts. You could see actual cuts to K through 12 education, which Democrats in the legislature are not going to want to do. For sure, you're going to see pushes for higher taxes, but is Governor Newsom going to want to do that? And are legislators really going to want to do that in an election year? They definitely have a budget mess on their hands, but the days of the $100 billion surplus are certainly long behind us.
Well, Tim, what worries me is that generally over the next few months, these deficits get bigger and bigger and bigger, don't you think? So maybe 68 billion is just the first firing shot, because the market has recovered a little bit, but it's not great. So as everyone knows, we've talked about in this podcast and has done a lot of work on this, is that so much of our tax base comes from capital gains. And people aren't making money in the market, and there are no capital gains to tax. So that's been a big issue. And if we have a slowing economy and a dull market, then we could potentially see this get larger. The other issue is that, I'm still thankful that we have a balanced budget amendment here, that we have to balance the budget in California. Folks, we have a big, fat, bloated government. We should be able to cut $68 billion from it. And I thank Pete Wilson and Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the day for championing a balanced budget amendment.
One of the other issues, too, that we have to think about is that there's a lot of budgetary borrowing throughout the year. So there's bond measures. Well, we have to pay for borrowing costs for that. There's also, not all the money comes in evenly throughout the year. So you have budgetary borrowing throughout the year to kind of make all the payments from the state go out on time. And then sometimes, you can engage in fund borrowing and others as a budgetary tool. Well, because interest rates are where they are, it's going to cost more this upcoming year. It's already costing more, but it's going to cost more for these bond measures and for any budgetary borrowing that they engage in. So there's that going on as well that complicates things. But Ro, you're exactly right. Gavin Newsom has tempered Jerry Brown's philosophy of live within our means. You only use one-time money for one-time purposes. Governor Newsom speaks about that rhetorically, but we've significantly increased spending during his governorship, and we're kind of paying the price right now. And certainly the LAO over the next 4 or 5 fiscal years, they're not projecting that revenue is going to come back very fast, that we're going to be in kind of a decline, but slowly increasing budget area for a while. We're going to see what they do. Last year's budget, in hindsight, probably was kind of a reckless budget, and they're going to need to make some immediate fixes to it, and they're really going to have to get their priorities in order going forward.
Yeah, and that doesn't bode well for Newsom's political fortunes if he's going to have to make some drastic cuts. So he's already polling pretty low during his tenure, and so he won't be happy about that.
Yeah, he's at the lowest approval ratings of his governorship. He's in the mid to high 40s right now, which, some governors might be okay with that, but certainly is down off of his record highs. And, it sets up a fight with an increasingly liberal legislature that's not going to want to cut spending, that's not going to want to cut from their priorities. So I think the solutions, quote unquote, you're going to see is going to be a lot of, well, let's kick this program down a year or two. They're not going to want to make cuts. They're going to argue we just restored the cuts from the last recession. So he's going to have a real battle with legislative liberals to make the kind of cuts that we need to make. And also, too, they're going to want to spend all the money in the rainy day fund as quickly as possible. And you're limited, with what withdrawals you can make. They're going to want to do that as well. So it's going to be very interesting to see, we could have a very intense and early budget fight. Normally these budget fights are happening in May, June. Well, we're going to have to make some mid-year budget adjustments now in January and February when the legislature comes back. So, the governor certainly does not have an easy January ahead of him.
Well, before we get started on the podcast, I wanted to say a few words about Kevin McCarthy, who has announced his retirement from Congress. I think he's doing the right thing. He's already achieved the highest level of office in the House. Why not do some other things? Hopefully, he'll be active in California politics. I think he's still got a lot to contribute. The GOP is a pretty weak state, actually, and maybe he could contribute to shoring up his party, maybe even making a run for governor. Tim, you're pretty conversant in all of the districts. I know that his Bakersfield district is pretty safe.
Well, yes, his district will be in safe Republican hands. I think it's the most Republican congressional district in the state. Just announcing this morning, there's been a lot of kind of musical chairs of who's going to run, who's not going to run, including as we tape this podcast. It's kind of up there because we're taping this on Monday morning, and Wednesday the 13th is the filing deadline. Assemblyman Vince Fong, who initially said he was not going to run for Congress, announced this morning that he is going to run for Congress. State Senator Shannon Grove, who was considered, a formidable candidate for the seat, she's announced she's not going to run. Several other kind of maybe contenders, Assemblyman Devin Mathis and some others, my old boss, former Congresswoman Connie Conway, they've all announced they're not going to run. So there could be a little issue with the ballot access because Assemblyman Fong has already filed a run for re-election. And so there could be questions, whether he is able to pull his name off from running for re-election and run for the congressional seat. So that could make this a little interesting. But at the end of the day, there is no question that the seat will remain in Republican hands. And if all goes well with Assemblyman Fong getting on the ballot, he should be the overwhelming favorite to win.
For our podcast guest this week, we have Richard Samuelson, who is a historian and associate professor of government at Hillsdale's College, and he's also a PRI board member. So Professor Samuelson is an expert on the American founding, early American history, and John Adams. Well, he reminded us that it is the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party this week. So we thought we'd have him on. After all, we're a free market think tank, and we can't say enough about taxation without representation.
Well, and I was reminded with our discussion of I had the chance to, when I was in Boston a few summers ago, to walk the Freedom Trail from start to finish. And boy, if you're a history buff and love all revolutionary history discussion, that's a must do for you. And you literally walk a yellow line from, it's on the sidewalk. So you literally just follow the yellow line from one end to the other. And you go through all the places you've heard about, the Old North Church and all those sorts of things. And also, on your way out there to the end, you see the frigate Constitution is out there as well. You can go on a tour of that. So I was fascinated with Richard's discussion here. But so for a little change of pace as we get close to the holidays, and for a good discussion of what all was going on during the Boston Tea Party time and how does it relate to our current political sagas that we're going through, I think this is the episode for you.
Thanks so much, everyone. And here's Professor Richard Samuelson. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Professor Samuelson.
Thank you for having me.
So this week marks the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, and we're lucky to have historian and Hillsdale Associate Professor Richard Samuelson with us. So Professor Samuelson is also a member of the PRI board. Now, I don't know about the kids these days, but at least in our generation, we learned about the Boston Tea Party right around middle school, I think. So Professor Samuelson, set this up for us. Remind us what the Boston Tea Party was all about.
Well, the short version, I suppose, working a little backward, the evening of December 16th, 1773, a bunch of residents of Bostonian and nearby towns, disguised as Indians, boarded 3 ships and dumped about a little over 90,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor, valued at roughly 10,000 pounds sterling. So a lot of tea, right? And that was part of a larger ongoing tax protest. The tea ships had arrived up to 20 days earlier, and they tried to get them to go back because the colonists did not think it was a legal tax that had been imposed upon the tea. The governor repeatedly refused to let the ships out, and rather than let the 20-day clock for the tea to be landed under government auspices and therefore the tax go into effect by force majeure, the colonists reacted off the books by destroying all the tea. So it's part of the larger dispute of no taxation with the representation, which went back to the Sugar and Stamp Acts of 1763 and 64, and will culminate in the Revolution with the Declaration of Independence of July 1776.
So, as anyone who's been to Boston and had the opportunity to walk the Freedom Trail, which I had the chance to do a couple of summers ago, and I highly recommend, you learn that taxation without representation would, of course, become the battle cry of the columnists. So, paint the picture of the deteriorating relationships between the colonies and Britain that set up this conflict.
Well, it's very interesting because in the early 1760s, George III became king. His grandfather, George II, had passed, they got a new king, and the colonists loved him. He was feted up and down the continent. Within 15 years of his coronation, they would turn on him. So they loved being British, but they loved being British partly because they enjoyed their rights, including the right to govern themselves by their legislatures they had in the colonies. The only representative assemblies in the Americas at the time were those in the British Empire. The Spanish and French empires had no representative government. And that included the right especially to be taxed by consent, a right that in English law went back at least to Magna Carta, the year 1215. And so starting in 1764 with the Sugar Act and then the Stamp Act of 1765, the British Parliament tried to impose taxes on the colonies. And the colonists kept resisting. And Parliament would repeal the tax, but then try to show that they weren't stepping down as a matter of rights, and they would put in a new tax. And that kept going back and forth until the issue got forced with the Tea Act of 1773. The tax on tea had actually begun in 1767 as part of the Townshend Acts. Taxes on lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea, and a few others. And those were repealed. Colonists protested, boycotted, say we're not going to buy any goods that would have the tax on it to prove that they do not assent to this tax, do not allow it to go into force. And the British repealed it roughly about the same time as the Boston Massacre of March 1770. And then they left the Tea Act symbolically. And some of the colonists were buying tea, some were buying smuggled tea. There was some push. They weren't 100% careful never to buy tea with the actual duty on it. But then in 1770, 1773, because the East India Company was struggling, Parliament tried to help them by radically changing the way they operated, cutting out all the middlemen, all the people who are other people engaged in trade, and trying to force this tax down the throat of the colonists. And in just about all the other colonies, the colonists just said no and it was returned. But instead, Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts, whose sons actually owned some of the tea that was destroyed, said, no, we're going to force it and force this tea to be landed. So that's the slightly longer version of the story of how you get to the Tea Party. Once the tea entered the port of Boston, you had 20 days before it became forfeit to the government, and then they could forcibly land the tea. Hence the Tea Party on December 16th, 1773.
Another interesting thing about the Boston Tea Party that people may not realize is that it really was kind of the beginning in the U.S. of all of these international trade issues that continue to dominate our politics today, of course. So could you set up for us kind of how this, all started, our path to being, to all that we're doing on the global marketplace today?
Yeah, it's very interesting that think of tea was not a common product outside of China, India, that part of the world for most of history. It's after 1700 you start to have lots of tea being traded, and it comes over. Even the colonists, the average colonist had probably, some estimates, half a cup of tea per day. But of course, given the number of colonists under 16, half the population, something like that, right? The average adult might have had a cup or more of tea per day. I haven't dug into the actual statistics to see if how some people put the number a little higher, but it's a lot. And tea has benefits. It's better than booze. Keep your water pure. You put some booze in it, keeps you awake. Apparently, tea has fluoride, which doesn't explain English teeth, I suppose. But the tea as a consumer good, spreading to more and more people and being shipped in the age of sail. You can imagine how many sailboats, how many people working on the sailboats, how many merchants were involved. That's what this story is partly about. And also the rise of a middle class, where lots of people are able to drink tea. It's not a rare treat only for an elite. And so the Tea Act was partly about the British trying to secure the monopoly for their tea company, or the East India Company, which sold the tea, which had the tea from the start to the end. And the colonists were more interested in having a market as a practical matter to allow the tea to buy tea from whoever. The British wanted to practice mercantilism. The colonists, by default, were more interested in letting the tea follow the market. And so part of the story of no taxation representation is also a question of regulation. The colonists, by implication, are more supportive of a market approach to the movement of goods and services around the world in the 1770s. And the British are still thinking mercantilely. And remember, in 1776 is the year Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations, in which he gives a very strong argument for free trade.
So these tea trade war tensions became so high that not long after, we had the Boston Massacre of 1770. So what started out as a snowball fight got out of hand and ended up with, you've had 5 dead colonists and a half a dozen more wounded. So take us back to the rage the colonists must have felt against Britain during that period.
Right. Well, in 1770, 3 years before the Tea Party, you had the Townshend Act's been on the books for 3 years. The colonists had been protesting and not wanting them. And the British, to try to crack down on Boston, had sent troops to town. And the troops did not get along with the locals. The locals did not get along with the troops. And of course, in their spare time, the troops and the locals did not get along very well. Some of the sailors and others, they could work, and they didn't need to work full time. They were trying to supplement their income so they could work at a discount, which the locals resented. Think of your classic stories of working class brawling, if you see it in old movies. And there's a lot of that going on. And this culminates in an incident that becomes known as the Boston Massacre, when the colonists and the British soldiers start getting into it verbally, and then the soldiers retreat outside their barracks, and the colonists are throwing rocks and ice and other things. And it's not clear exactly why shots were fired. The officer might have said, don't fire, and they heard fire. It could be someone fell and a shot went off, and then once shots went off, they shot more. We haven't quite gotten to the full bottom of that. But the incident culminated in the British soldiers killing several people in Boston. And of course, in the trial, they were acquitted of murder. It was down to manslaughter. And showing that the Americans did not object to the troops as people. They objected to the British effort to govern by military force, as opposed to allowing the American colonies, the British American colonies, to govern themselves with free government under British law and with the elected government that they had elected themselves in Boston, rather than being governed by the king's troops. And that takes you, what's the result of the Boston Tea Party 3 years later? Right, at first, people like George Washington thought that's much too extreme, destroying all that property. And remember, they had to, this was work. The way the Tea Party happened is very interesting. They actually got teamsters and people who were used to working on ships to know how to lift these 300-400-pound chests of tea and throw them in the harbor, and they had to break them so the tea was destroyed. They actually sent people into the harbor. It was very low tide to make sure the tea was mixed into the water so it couldn't be used. And they only attacked the tea. This was a very narrowly focused mob. You think people are dressed in costume, they're on a ship, destroying tea, they're drinking, they're partying, they're making a mess. No, there are people making sure nothing got out of hand. They only destroyed the tea. They broke into one captain's quarters. They repaid him for the lock. One person tried to break into the booze. They stopped him from doing it, right? So this was a protest against what they regard as the illegal tea. And the British, in reaction to the destruction of that property, which the colonists tried to have narrowly focused, they regarded it as absolutely unacceptable. And they tried essentially to end the free government of Boston and of Massachusetts, to put the whole colony of Massachusetts under military government. So you wound up losing the rights of Britons in Boston in reaction to the Tea Party. That's Parliament's reaction. And then George Washington says, yeah, of course, Tea Party was too much, I might think, but this is crazy. We can't allow Parliament to give itself the right to take away our free government. And so the Tea Party precipitated what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, what the British called the Coercive Acts. They were trying to coerce the colonists. And those coalesced into the First Continental Congress, and then ultimately Lexington and Concord and independence. So the Tea Party and the reaction to it were the spark that got you from those earlier events, like the Stamp Act protests and riots, to the Boston Massacre, the boycott of the Townshend Acts, also to the Tea Party, to the reaction to the Tea Party, and ultimately the war and then independence.
So eventually, all the taxes that were imposed by the colonists were repealed, except the tea tax. And the Brits weren't about to give up on this tax on 1.2 million pounds of tea that the colonists were drinking. Now, of course, we saw tea smuggling increased, and listeners might not know that John Hancock and Samuel Adams, you think of Sam Adams, of course, for beer. Well, they were actually big tea smugglers. And while Hancock and Adams were protesting the taxes, they wanted to protect their tea smuggling businesses as well. So how did all that work out?
Yeah, this was, again, the question of, it's an interesting question about the origin of market thinking. In some ways, people were greedily saying, I want my tea, which is not from the British monopoly tea. And then what follows is people start looking at what's the most efficient, what's the most rational, what's the most, frankly, the most unarbitrary way to do it. That is, which way can the law be enforced most consistently across as many people as possible? And so with the colonists saying the British have no right to put this tax on tea, let's step back for a second. Before 1760s, the British would put a duty, say, on French tea or French molasses and say, well, that's so you buy English over French molasses. And the colonists says, that's okay. That's not a tax. That's a duty to, as a matter of policy, to say, buy this, not that. However, starting in 1764, the British say, we want to raise money from this. That's why we're proposing this tax on, well, first sugar, molasses, and then tea. So the colonists say, you do not have the right to tax us without our consent. Interestingly, it's the opposite of the argument Justice Roberts made in Obamacare about what's legal, what's not legal, but it's the same logic. That is, a penalty would be legal for the colonists, but not a tax. And so what the colonists are arguing is Parliament has no right to tax tea. And this was a new tax they had posed recently. And they did collect some, but they never collected all that much as a percentage from it. It's not like the tobacco tax, which was, I think, 1/4 of all the revenue from all of the colony, of their duty revenue. The tea revenue was not that high percentage, but it was a lot potentially. And the tea company was in trouble. And so the tax could potentially save the company. That was the real motivating factor here. And also to demonstrate that they had the right to tax the colonists, which Parliament was loath to give up.
So let's recount the night blow by blow. In comes the Sons of Liberty, colonial merchants and tradesmen led by Adams and Hancock. So what happened on the night of December 16th, 1773?
Well, on the day of December 16th, they actually made a final appeal to the governor and to the owner of the ships to let the tea go. And the governor refused. And there's a huge meeting at Old South Church, the biggest gathering place in Boston, discussing what do we do about it and, riling up the crowd a bit. And finally, after that's gone on for a while, I think it's Sam Adams, didn't double check my memory on this, says, well, there's nothing to be done. At which point the folks dressed as Native Americans run through town, run down to the dock and board these 3 ships and in very organized fashion remove the tea. One guy had to change. He was a captain on one ship. He looks at the plank and sees the officer of the deck is his brother-in-law. He'll recognize me. Whoops, better change ships. But it was a very organized endeavor to offload the tea, to dump it into the harbor, to spoil the tea, just to make sure the tea could not be used. They're protesting what they regarded as illegal tea once the British are trying to force its landing. And it was only in Massachusetts they tried to force its landing. In Charleston, it was locked away and then sold after the Revolution started. Everywhere else, it just went back. So partly what happened here is Thomas Hutchinson, the governor, tried to force the issue. He was too far away from local public opinion to understand the implications of what he was doing. He could have found a way, a legal excuse, a legal fiction to send it back, because formally you needed a legal reason once it's landed, once it entered the harbor, not formally landed, to send it back. But what happened on that day is the colonists organized through a public action to spoil the tea, to make sure the tea does not land. In common law, there is a title called non-user. That is a law never enforced, is considered a dead letter. Now, I said the tea tax had been paid in the breach sometimes, but they were essentially symbolically still living in that world. Hence, they wanted to show that they do not accept that this is a legitimate tax. So the mob action was, strangely to our day, it was an accepted part of British politics if done in a certain spirit, and people always complained it was done in the wrong spirit whenever it was done, was a legal maneuver done through extra-legal means, that is non-regular government, to protest what the colonists regarded as an illegal tax on tea.
So we read in the history books that it took nearly 3 hours for more than 100 colonists to dump tea into the Boston harbor. The chests held more than 45 tons of tea, which would cost $1 million today. And of course, if this happened now, you'd still make headlines. So tell us about the aftermath of the tea dumping.
Well, in the aftermath, as I mentioned a little bit before, that other colonists, locally, they thought, John Adams said this is a bold move, but it had to be done. Leaders elsewhere, Ben Franklin thought maybe they should pay for that back. Washington thought it was excessive. But the British thought it was an insult, and they made the mistake of thinking they could isolate Massachusetts and Boston by focusing punishment on them, making it such a severe punishment, all the other colonies would back down. But instead of isolating Massachusetts from the other colonies and forcing Massachusetts to back down, they united the colonies, because the logic they came out, they realized was, if the British Parliament, which they did not think had any jurisdiction once it gets inside the water's edge into their colonies, if the Parliament could essentially get rid of the government of Massachusetts, it could do that to anybody. So the colonists united to protest the argument that Parliament had ultimate authority in the colonies. The colonists thought they had 150 years or so, roughly speaking, depending upon where, of government across the ocean, had precedence for what was allowed, what was not allowed. And a lot of that was before Parliament became so powerful. And so Parliament was adjusting to a world in which they were now the center of British government, had been before. But the result of Parliament's effort to assert its dominance in the colonies was to unite the colonies in a way they'd never been united before. The colonies, by and large, were separate, though New England had a separate identity, but each other colony, they related more to Britain than the colonies next door. The reaction to the Intolerable Acts Britain imposed after the Tea Party was to bring the colonists together in the First Continental Congress, which met in September of 1774, and then the second one met after Lexington and Concord in the spring of 75. So the result of this mob action to prevent the tea from being landed was one, to assert the colonists continue to deny Parliament's right to tax, and two, to force Parliament's view, to assert their dominance. The result was to unite the colonies, and you're on your road to revolution independence, in which the Americans assert the right of themselves to govern ourselves without the consent of the king, to govern ourselves by our own consent, with no arbitrary leader elected by birth.
You alluded to this earlier, but not everyone was happy about what happened. John Adams, you're an expert on John Adams, was thrilled, but other prominent leaders, not so much. George Washington thought that private property should never be destroyed. Ben Franklin believed that we ought to pay the British East India Company back. Talk about some of these personalities and why some of our leaders back in the day, our founding fathers, had different perspectives.
Well, think about the principle of no taxation without representation. It's your money, it's your private property. And then we, the people, decide how much to give the government in a year. In a sense, they thought of taxation as our gift in the British world to the king. It's not as if the king has everything and then whatever we're allowed at the end of the year, we keep. No, it's our property. It's private. We own it outright. And we decide how much his budget's going to be. So that's the same principle. It's private property that's involved in the problem of destroying the tea from the perspective of Washington and Franklin and others. Why are you attacking the tea of a corporation in order to protest the government's policies in London? Of course, the interesting thing here is that the East India Company was not just a small corporation. The business corporation, as a separate idea, was only in the process of being developed. It, of course, ran colonies itself. It was a ginormous entity. And the business side of selling tea was only one part of it. And so from another perspective, it's quasi-private, quasi-public, because it's the kind of entity in British law at the time that wasn't, strictly speaking, 100% separable from British government. It could be legally, but not really in practice, given all they did. But the key thing here is the American Revolution was done to a great degree in defense of private property. So a lot of people got angry at the tactic of destroying property in order to protest an invasion of property rights. And that's where the nub of this issue, the complication was. But after repeatedly trying to get the governor to let the tea go back because they weren't going to let it land, the people in Boston decided they had no other choice. It was either dump the tea or allow the taxation without representation to be enforced. And therefore, even if it's done by force, the precedent of all this tea being landed and taxed would, as a matter of precedent, establish the right of Parliament to tax the colonies. So they thought that was necessary. Others thought it was a step too far. And maybe you do dump the tea and pay the company back. That may have been Franklin's middle position. But as I said, things happened so quickly afterwards with the intolerable acts by Parliament and then the Continental Congress reacting to the tolerable acts, that became a secondary issue to the deeper issue of would these colonies have free government at all as long as the British were in charge.
So let's expand on that. Of course, King George and Parliament wanted retribution. And, for those of our listeners who have seen the musical Hamilton, well, it wasn't a funny little song by King George III. So tell us how they responded after the tea was dumped.
They responded by what, as I said, the colonists called the intolerable acts. The British called the coercive acts, to coerce Boston. Boston Harbor was shut till they paid for the tea. They suspended the regular, what we would call democratic process, the electoral process in Massachusetts. What's interesting, big mistake they did was they shut down the town meetings, the famous New England town meetings throughout Massachusetts. So now every town felt the reach of the king's government shutting down their local government. They imposed military government on Massachusetts and appointed a military governor, General Gage. And so they cracked down, they tried to isolate Boston and impose military government on this recalcitrant colony. Edmund Burke looked at this. He gave a couple brilliant speeches on conciliation. He said, well, what are you trying to achieve here? If you win, if you force the colonists to knuckle under, you will have killed the goose that laid the golden egg. He notes just how much money is being made by the British through all the trade that goes through the empire. As a percentage on all that money they're making, the taxation was a small amount. So it was a false economy. But Parliament saw itself as fundamentally in charge of Britain. So you had Parliament trying to assert its role governing the empire, and the colonists asserting their property rights against the king's government under Parliament. And in the middle was this effort to coerce Massachusetts. And you get to the First Continental Congress in September of 74. Sam Adams, the last Puritan in Boston, tries to play it cool. He's radical to show that, no, I'm not a fanatic. And the Massachusetts camp their delegation is able to persuade the others to ally with Boston in a stronger remonstrance, as opposed to the weaker remonstrance that Joseph Galloway of Philadelphia would have wanted. He is and a loyalist, whereas the United Colonies face a united front saying these are unacceptable. It's unacceptable for Britain to attack American government in general, the colonial American governments in general. And how does Sam Adams demonstrate that he's not recalcitrant? He's the last Puritan. Among other things, he attends a Catholic Mass. If you know anything about the old Puritans in that era, the Pope is the Antichrist to them. So he's showing this is not about our disagreements about Christianity, or not Christianity, as Sam Adams thought. This is about us having a common cause against the tyranny Parliament is trying to impose. So that's the reaction to the Tea Act. It unites all of Massachusetts and then unites all of the colonists, the reaction to Britain's effort to crack down after the Tea Party.
So we now see Continental Congress being formed after these new restrictions, and then followed by the quote, shot heard around the world that sparked the American Revolution. So any lessons to be learned from the Boston Tea Party?
I think a couple or a few. One is that property rights were fundamental to the American Revolution. And another is the method. Note the crowd protest was not, there were protests that got out of hand, but it was very focused. Right? This was the effort of the middle class. We're all drinking tea. We are respectable people. We're not those unruly mobs. In some ways, the leadership wants that so they can dismiss them as people not to be listened to, right? We tried several times to work through regular process. You're still ignoring us. You don't have the right to tax us. This is all we have the right to do. The other thing is the importance of leadership understanding the people they're governing. Thomas Hutchinson didn't understand what he was doing, that he was poking the bear, nor did Parliament. They both misunderstood the likely consequences of their action. That is, it's very important for people who are trying to govern any land, right, to be in close touch, to have the pulse of the people for whom they're making laws. And I think one of the stories here was the leadership class in Massachusetts, and to great degree, perhaps in Parliament, they didn't understand what the colonies were about. They didn't recognize them. They didn't understand them. And that caused a great deal of trouble. To give you an example, in Massachusetts, 80 or 90% of the adult males could vote. That was 15% or so probably voted in Britain. And they saw all these colonists. They thought they're all the unwashed rabble who don't vote. No, these were respectable middle-class people who drank tea every day. And so they are equals in a social way, to a degree economically, and they're trying to assert their equal right in the empire. And the British are still thinking themselves as aristocrats governing peasants when it came to the empire. And that's where the underlying tension is. So it's very important to respect property rights and for leadership class to understand the people they wish to govern.
So, Richard, as we close, can any of the lessons of the Boston Tea Party and the aftermath be applied to our, current political situation today?
Yes, I think so. One is look at how the Tea Party operated. They were an out-of-doors, off-the-books action, but by the overwhelming consensus in Boston, and they were done in as narrowly tailored a way as possible. There had been unruly mobs, but they were very narrowly tailored just to attack the illegal tea. And they tried to work through government channels, and they kept getting rebuffed. I think that's important to note. They tried to work as much as possible in the law. And on the other side, it's also important for a governing class to understand the people that they would govern. It'll cause a lot of trouble when there's a great distinction between the people who wants to rule and the common citizen, to use our terms for it. John Adams said the lower house, it should be like a miniature of the people. It should think, feel, reason, and act like the people, like a good statistical sample. So you get a good sense of common opinion. And when the people above that house or outside of it are making policy, they actually get feedback that is based on a representative sample of the people they're making laws for. And I do wonder, as more and more of our government is done the bureaucracy and less of the democratic process, but that bureaucracy still thinks it's 1900 where the democratic process rules. That bureaucracy doesn't appreciate just how important it is to have a firm sense of what American public opinion is. And as they make rules and enforce them, to do so in a way that is most consistent with the people they would govern. Public opinion always matters, and you can't govern against it. And it's also true that in case of the American Revolution, fundamentally it might be true that the scope of private property, which is what they're defending, the right to tax by consent and govern by consent, is fundamental to an egalitarian society. That is, participation in the political process is part of what they're fighting for, and having independent means and independent access to the political system. That's all a very important part of the story. And I wonder if nowadays, partly because Congress delegates just so much authority to the bureaucracy, and they use 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old laws that have never been modified or hadn't modified much by Congress, that there's a danger of our governing class being like Thomas Hutchinson, losing touch with the people. And that's always a dangerous situation. So it's important to have a government close to the people. And it's also important, if you wish to have the rule of law, for the people to take themselves with enough respect to realize when they are protesting the government, when they think the government is acting illegally, it is very important that they minimize the degree to which we ourselves act contrary to law, try to act always under the confines of law, and in the extreme case, minimize the degree to which you are doing a protest that exceeds the boundaries of law. I think we've lost the senses on both sides of what it means to have what John Adams calls a republic of laws, not of men. Or we're in danger of forgetting what that means in the context of a democratic republic such as ours.
Thanks so much, Professor Samuelson.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and happy anniversary of the Tea Party.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.